Welcome back, everyone. Moving on with the conference. This session, there will be two paper presentation, one by Dr. Nishant and the other by Dr. Sebastian Valapalli. Let us now have Andrew Francis to moderate this session. Andrew Francis has an MA in philosophy from the University of Kerala. He is specialized in Indian philosophies and currently pursuing his doctoral studies at Jnanadeepa on the concept of bhavana in Mimamsa. Andrew, welcome to the stage.
Good morning, my dear friends. As it was already announced, we have two presentations, one by Dr. Nishant Alphonse, the other by Dr. Sebastian Valapalli. And the theme of this session is socio-religious perspectives on food. You know, in India, everything can come under one discipline. Politics, philosophy, sociology, everything can come under one discipline. So politics, religion, everything is merged together. So it is going to be a very interesting paper and presentation. So we will have 20 minutes first presentation by Dr. Nishant, then 20 minutes presentation by Dr. Sebastian, and then 20 minutes for interaction. So let me welcome Dr. Nishant and Dr. Sebastian over to the dais. Please. Friends, Dr. Nishant is going to discuss with us the food politics in India. He's a professor at Jnanadeepa here. To his credit, he has two doctorate in ethics and philosophy from France. Also, he has a master's which is equivalent MPhil in the same university. Currently, he is a dean of studies in the philosophy of faculty of philosophy. And he's also a visiting faculty in many universities and colleges, and he has wrote many books, edited, and published many articles in national and international conferences. And he's a regular contributor to Light of God, a bi-monthly magazine which is published in Kerala. He's a founding member of the Jnanadeepa Center of Applied Ethics, and he also chaired the head of the department in the Faculty of Doctoral Studies in Philosophy. So now he's the head of this program. Of course, we have the convener, Dr. Sebastian, but he is the chief marshal of this entire conference. So over to Dr. Nishant Giryodasan.
First of all, thank you, Andrew, for your nice introduction. My paper is not titled Food Politics in India, but Food Politics in Religion. So religion does not belong only to India, but it also exists everywhere. And perhaps the most influential world religions are the religions of the book. So I will begin with that in the first place. And then eventually I will move on to Hinduism itself. To give some ideas about why there is some kind of politics behind the food practices that exist. I will then make an attempt to speak about the possible explanations that emerge primarily from the social sciences, the different social sciences, and also will indicate its own limitations, the explanations that are offered by the social sciences and the limitations. And finally, I will end my paper with some appeal for the primacy of public order over religious demands and religious requirements. I realize for some reason my laptop has been acting up and I'm not getting my laptop turned on for some reason. Maybe somebody can try to fix that. But anyway, I can speak without this as we have the PowerPoint there. Right, you can move to the next slide. As I told you, this is what the brief outline of my paper going to be. First, I will engage with you on some of the foundational texts. When I speak about foundational texts, I must give you a word of caution. It is easy to speak about foundational texts when it comes to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but it is rather difficult to speak about foundational texts in Hinduism, given the fact that it is very diverse and it is not just one monolithic religion. It has got different currents, and therefore we need to be cautious about speaking foundational texts when it comes to Hinduism. Nevertheless, I will focus on the Vedic aspect of Hinduism. I will try to give some explanation from social sciences, as I told you, and point out its limitations. I will not be able to exhaust all possible explanations, brief indications for us to understand, and finally, my appeal. Let us move to the next slide. All right, I have chosen only these four religions, primarily for want of time, but also because these four religions are quite influential today in the world, including Hinduism. With all the diaspora Indians abroad, it makes its own impact, and therefore, though Buddhism is also an influential religion, for want of time, I have left out. And in Indian point of view, Buddhism, Jainism, they are all somehow incorporated or merged within this larger understanding of Hinduism. Therefore, it's fine. We look at just Hinduism as such. I shall begin with Judaism for the simple reason because Judaism has more prohibitions, perhaps, when it comes to food practices than any other religion. You can move to the next slide. The reason why Judaism has four more prohibitions, nobody is able to understand it fully, but we do know that the Hebrew texts are full of prohibitions, particularly the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. So if you are familiar with these two books, and most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these two books, you will understand the amount of prohibitions that you find. One of the important prohibitions that we find in Judaism is that only the ruminant animals and animals with split hooves are pure. That means only you can consume those animals. They should be both ruminant and they should have split hooves. Some animals are ruminant. For example, camel is ruminant, but camel doesn't have split hoof. Therefore, you cannot consume camel. So this is the fundamental criterion with which they have forbidden some animals. Pig, for example, has split hoof, but pig is not ruminant. And therefore, you cannot consume pork. So this is the fundamental criterion. Again, they also speak about reptiles, all kind of reptiles, the crawling animals, they are forbidden. They are considered unclean. They cannot be consumed. I am not giving the reference here that you can check in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. When the paper gets published, you will find those references. For want of time, I will go quickly. Also, another important aspect, the animals that are sacrificed to idols, you cannot consume. Because idol worship is wrong, therefore the foods that are sacrificed to animals. You will find that getting continued in Christianity, particularly the early Christians, they had serious conflicts when it comes to consuming food offered to idols. You also have the ban on consuming blood, because blood is life, life belongs to God, and this is a theological explanation. Of course, we have to find from our social science point of view whether these explanations are tenable, but these are theological explanations they give, and therefore you cannot consume blood. There is also a specific rule that you cannot mix meat with milk. And particularly, there is one text which speaks very strongly against mixing meat with milk or cooking meat in milk. Now, you have, on special occasions, special prohibitions are there. For example, Judaism does not prohibit you from drinking wine. Does it? Does Judaism prohibit you from drinking wine? It doesn't. But when a priest, when he goes to the temple, when he connects to the sacred, then he must not have any intoxicating drink, including wine. So these are restricted to specific people or specific occasions. For Sabbath, you have got some special norms for dietary practices, etc., etc. But they are very specific, either according to the season or according to the people. But otherwise, these are some of the standard prohibitions. And the most known ones are the animals that are not ruminant, they don't have split hooves, that you cannot consume. Now let us go to Islam. Now Islam interestingly continues some of these prohibitions. Islam, the Quranic texts make explicit reference to Torah, and therefore they continue some of these prohibitions. Particularly, they are against eating pork, just like the Jews, and we know that very well because of our relationship with our Muslim brothers in our country. Of course, you cannot eat the dead animal. Also, you cannot eat the meat that is offered to the idols. You cannot eat the blood. So these are some of the things that they continue from the Jewish tradition. But of course, Islam should also come up with something specific. Otherwise, Islam, as a religion, it will not have its own unique contribution to make. And therefore, Islam would cancel out some prohibitions from Judaism and reintroduce or introduce some new prohibitions. For example, camel meat is allowed in Islam, unlike in Judaism. That is something cancelling the prohibition of Judaism. But on the contrary, they also introduce some new prohibitions. For example, wine and alcoholic beverages are totally prohibited. So, if you know your Muslim friends, they will tell you in their religion, you cannot have wine, and that goes against their religion. Unlike in Judaism, only for the priest who is entering the temple to offer sacrifice, for whom wine is forbidden. For Islam, for all people, wine, alcoholic beverages are forbidden. This is something that they introduced. But also, you have the introduction of certain specific kind of fasting, particularly during the month of Ramadan. You should eat before sunrise. Is that right? Yeah? And then also at sunset. So there are certain specific norms, specific rules about your food habits that they introduced in Islam. But it is interesting to note why this certain continuity and certain discontinuity. It's obvious. Islam wants to show that we are superior to the Jews. Every prohibition, either when you cancel or when you introduce something new, you want to assert your supremacy. I mean, from the sociological point of view. No, I'm not speaking from a theological point of view. Now let us move to Christianity. Oftentimes, Christianity is a very familiar religion, perhaps to most of us. And we think in Christianity, there is an end of prohibition. To some extent, it is true. In Mark, oftentimes it is quoted, Jesus saying, what defiles a man is not what goes inside, but what comes out of man. And Mark explicitly states there, he makes a commentary. Jesus declared, thus all food to be pure. So Mark adds a comment to the statement of, he does an exegesis there by himself, to the statement of Jesus. So it is about the food. Everything is pure. There is nothing forbidden, nothing impure, and so on and so forth. Well, that is the ideal. But in the early Christian community, we know there were controversies, particularly about Peter eating in the house of the Roman centurion, right? And therefore, in the controversy, finally, they came up with a compromise formula. What is the compromise formula? Well, we will not give too much of burden. The Spirit has guided us that we will not burden people with too much of prohibitions when it comes to food, except you should not consume food that is offered to the idols. So, in any case, that is not cancelled out, at least in that so-called First Council of Jerusalem. Some people say it is incorrectly called the First Council of Jerusalem. In any case, that is how they have come to agree upon. You cannot eat food that is offered to idols. Paul goes a step ahead. He says, fine, you can even eat food offered to idols. After all, idols are nothing. You need to avoid eating food offered to idols only if it scandalizes your fellow brother. Charity comes first, not so much of religious food prohibition. It's a question of charity for Paul, not so much about dietary prohibition. So I think Paul is much more here, pastoral in that sense, from our understanding, and seems to be quite open to consuming any kind of food, including food offered to idols. But that doesn't mean that Christianity has cancelled all food prohibitions. Tertullian reintroduced in the 2nd century AD, banning of consumption of blood. You should not, the Christians, that's part of Christian morality for Tertullian. And then in the Middle Ages, we have new norms, the ecclesiastical norms about fasting. I mean, almost half the year you have got some fasting or the other. Of course, thankfully, with the Second Vatican Council, with Paul VI, many of these things are left to the local church, and many things are cancelled. The traditional people will never eat, for example, on Fridays meat. Traditional Catholics, I'm talking about in this case. I have not discussed much about the Reformation churches. The Catholics, for example, Fridays meat is prohibited generally. But now, after the Second Vatican Council, though it is not prohibited, since we are used to not eating meat on all Fridays, we generally tend not to eat meat. You are aware of that. Well, there were other prohibitions that were introduced gradually. What does it point to? For some reason or the other, every religion seems it appropriate to have some restrictions and prohibitions when it comes to food. Now, they may come up with whatever theological reasons they have, but we'll have to find out what could be the other reasons from the sociological point of view, anthropological point of view, even psychological point of view. Now let us move on to Hinduism, which is a little more complex. As I told you right in the beginning, this is not very easy and straightforward, and the Vedic texts are very, very difficult to interpret in many ways. And in fact, the early Sanskrit texts do not seem to be, speaking anything against meat eating. Many scholars point out that meat eating is very common because the early settlers, they were nomadic people, and cattle was part of their life, and they were eating cattle, and the best meat they could offer to guests was apparently beef. And the animal sacrifice was commonly practiced in the Vedic period. And obviously what was sacrificed is consumed by those who sacrificed, right? So they were eating meat, so there was no problem. Only in the late Middle Ages, there are various theories. I'm not going into the different theories. Only it seems in the late Middle Ages, there was a link that was established by the elite community, the Brahminic communities here in India, between consumption of meat and untouchability. In other words, if anybody who consumes meat becomes impure and therefore untouchable. So that seems to be a concept that emerged much later. And obviously, in the 19th, 20th century, during the colonial India, this was heightened. And as we heard from Dr. Pandey during his lecture, that was one of the important aspects, that animated the discussion. Not only, Gandhi, even the other Congress members and the RSS groups. This was an animated discussion about the whole question of vegetarianism and how meat consumption is bad and how it can make you non-spiritual, and this kind of discourses were very common only in that colonial period. Until then, there doesn't seem to be much of an impact. Now, this is particularly, I'm referring this with regard to the famous historian and anthropological expert, Dr. D.N. Jha. So I'm only referring to his ideas. So I'm sure there may be various nuances here, and if I have left out some nuances, please pardon me on this. Now let us look at some possible explanations. How many minutes do I have? Only. All right, let us be a little fast here. Now I have only taken two of the possible explanations. There are various others that are possible. The primary of the explanations come from the social history point of view. Now when we speak about the social history, one of the important aspects is what makes a society determine certain things as pure and other things as impure. Now, obviously, there is a whole principle of purity and pollution that is at work in this case, the question of purity and pollution. This is particularly true of Hinduism because there are certain prohibitions that affect the scale of purity. The more you eat meat, the more impure you become. So the hierarchy of Varna is built on that. So you remain on the top in the hierarchy only because you are more pure. And what makes you more pure? That you follow the certain dietary prescriptions, that you follow certain prohibitions to the core. That's what makes you more pure. And you can see the hierarchy principle and this purity and pollution seems to play an important role in many religions, and this is especially true of Hinduism. And therefore we realize why there is too much of struggle, in India against this caste hegemony, the whole question of how do we deal with this caste issues, because this is very much engraved into our mindset. There are also other religions, other reasons, particularly in a country like India during the British rule, where there have been tensions that have been, mounting between the Hindus and the Muslims, which continues even today, unfortunately, perhaps orchestrated in a political manner. Now, there is a sense of who has a greater authority. So if you follow my prohibitions, if I can succeed to impose it on you, then I have a greater social authority than you. You see the struggle of power here, the power game that is at work. Why, therefore, the whole question of ban on cow meat, etc., comes from this: who has a greater power, greater authority. And that we know with the contemporary political scenario we are well aware of, and that I am not going to get into the details. However, satisfying this approach, this explanation is, there is still one problem this explanation does not account for. That problem is, it basically points finger at those who are elite, those who are of higher class or caste, who seem to be instrumentalizing this to assert their authority. But there is also this favorable reception from the marginalized groups. Why the marginalized groups receive this favorably instead of protesting, instead of reacting? Occasionally there are protests, but they are very, very marginal compared to the number of people in the lower strata. The protest seems to be very minimal. What makes them to receive this favorably seems to be not very clear. Now, from the second thing, from the structural anthropological, can move to the next slide and the next slide. Yeah, next slide. Yeah. From the structural anthropological point of view, there are some good things because they reject certain sanitary explanation or functional explanation. For example, people did not eat pork for hygienic reasons, or people in India, certain parts of India, did not eat beef for ecological reasons or economic reasons. It doesn't suit your health, or it doesn't promote your economy, because if you keep slaughtering beef, then your agrarian farming sector economy will survive. And these are all some of the explanations they reject outrightly. But they try to show, from the structural anthropological point of view, this is the way every religion tries to establish a relationship between human person nature or culture and nature. Seems to be a wonderful thing. This is particularly promoted by Mary Douglas. But the problem, secular currents also join hands with this. And I think this is one of the things that Dr. Pandey again spoke of when Gandhi was in London. There was already an organization of vegetarianism. That was a secular movement. That was not religious. But certain secular currents also join in reinforcing these prohibitions. And how do you ascribe this only to religion? There seems to be a little bit of problem. We need to explore into that. As I am wanting a want of time, I just want to conclude. You can move to the next slide. I want to make an appeal to the primacy of the public order. It is true that we need to try to balance between religious demands and public order. So there must be a state of apparatus, and the legislation must be very clear in drawing the line very clearly. Sure, religious respect sentiments when there is certain, like Mahavir Jayanti, there is no sale of meat. Okay, you respect it, but draw the line clearly. That's okay, on that day we have some sentiments and therefore we do it. Some kind of accommodation, some kind of lucid openness. This is what is needed. Some pragmatism. When you serve a non-veg meal, have a counter for vegetarian meal. Sure. So you kind of accommodate everyone. I think there have been many other such possible openness that we need to have. Perhaps we can challenge ourselves. We can go a little further. Can we imagine even asking believers and supporters of certain particular diet to break it occasionally and join others for the sake of conviviality. The desired, denying certain prohibitions of one's religion does not necessarily mean it endages one's faith if it contributes to mutual respect and mutual encounter. Thank you.
Father Nishant was discussing various religious foundational texts with a critical historical approach and made an appeal to all of us for us to ponder. Let us put a big hand to Father Nishant. Now we have Dr. Sebastian with us. He'll be going to discuss with us the political economy of Vada Pav. It will be going to be very interesting. He is presently the head of the Department of Indian Studies in this institute. He taught theology at Gujarat Vidyadip for 2 decades. And now he is teaching philosophy and theology here in this institute. Apart from giving lectures on philosophy and theology, his research interest also includes history, anthropology, and sociology. And he is a voracious reader and a prolific writer. So he writes scholarly articles in many areas. So welcome to Father Sebastian for the presentation.
Thank you for your kind words. My computer will take just 1 minute or so to. Oh, Iris here. Okay. How do I operate this? How do I to move ahead? Right. It's this one. Okay. Bring back. So, okay. The title of my paper is Political Economy of Vada Pav. I'm sure most of you may have tasted Vada Pav, and I was told that in Dinobili College today breakfast they had Vada Pav. So at least some of you are very familiar with Vada Pav. So as we go ahead, it will become clear to you what are we doing in this paper. This is part of a larger paper. I've been trying to write about this for past 8 years or so. So it's a larger paper. So I'll just go a little fast. Oh, okay. So this is the plan of the paper. Introduction, Vada Pav, a brief biographical sketch. Then Vada Pav political context in which, of Vada Pav. And third, Vada Pav political contestations. So that's the plan of the paper. So food has rarely been invoked as a regional identity marker or political symbol in India. Against this background, so, food has not been used. There are so many other things which has been used as identity marker, regionalism, etc., but not food. Against this background, in 2008, Shiv Sena began to take an unusual interest in the popular street food called Vada Pav. Now, my paper is basically political phenomenology. What's something that can be seen and things like that. Okay, so 2008, Shiv Sena began to take interest. Shiv Sena created a standardized fast food brand called Shiv Vada Pav. Shiv Vada Pav. Sena used Shiv Vada Pav as a cultural symbol to mobilize people in electoral politics with considerable success. This created a new political contestation between various political parties in Maharashtra. So this is mainly in Maharashtra, Bombay, etc. Shiv Sena brand of gastropolitics has hardly any parallels. For example, politicians in Tamil Nadu have not used popular food items like idli or dosha or vada for political mobilization or as a marker of religious identity, regional identity. Yeah? No, nobody is using in Tamil Nadu. Dosha, idli, no. For that matter, dabeli, dokla, fafda, and khaman are well-known regional food items in Gujarat. No politician in Gujarat has thought of using these food items for similar political purpose. Hardly any political parties in Punjab would seriously think of using regional street food items like chole bhature for political mobilization or regional identity creation. Politicians have not used items like dal bati churma, churma, yeah, in Rajasthan, nor aloo tikki in Uttar Pradesh for political purpose. No. Because of these reasons, the fairly effective use of food item like vada pav by Shiv Sena in Maharashtra politics remain a puzzling phenomenon. So basically a phenomenon. Such a puzzling phenomenon calls for some explanation. So this paper is an exploration of those, why this? This paper looks at the historical context, contestations and limitations of food politics surrounding vada pav. So primary interest of this paper is not vada pav in itself as a food item. Paper focused rather on the mediation of social and political dynamics surrounding vada pav. First part, vada pav, a biographical sketch. The origins of vada pav can be traced to the period around 1966-67. This period also coincides with the launch of Shiv Sena, the beginning of Shiv Sena, 1966-67. The invention of this street food is related to two factors, mainly. The unemployment of Marathi-speaking youth, and B, the food needs of mill workers who constituted a substantial section of the Bombay workforce. I'm quoting some authors. The origins and popularity of vada pav are usually attributed to the food needs of the textile mill workers. So, it was a favorite food of mill workers in the 1960s. There are conflicting claims about the origins of original inventor of vada pav. Who invented vada pav? There are conflicting reports about that. So, according to some reports, vada pav was first made in 1966 or 1967. It was made by a staunch Shiv Sena loyalist, Ashok Vaidya. Ashok was a snack seller outside Dadar railway station. Vaidya seems to have invented, in inverted commas, vada pav when he placed a vada in a pav, that means bread, at the request of a customer. That's the invention of vada pav. Some others credit Sudhagar Mahatre, a Shiv Sena sympathizer, as the first to create vada pav in 1966-67 in Bombay. Mahatre, a former mill worker, was the first one to set up a vada pav cart in Bombay. At that time, he used to sell it for 10 paise, vada pav, 10 paise. In the 1970s, the largest consumers of vada pav were the mill workers of central Bombay, Parel, Lower Parel area, those areas. At that time, it was sold for 25 paise. After mills closed down, sales of this popular food dropped drastically. Corporate life for vada pav began in 2001. In that year, Jumbo King began selling this street food with its brand name through its franchise retail stores. This food chain company used to sell 40,000 vada pavs in 2008. Second section, vada pav political context. From early years on, there seems to be a symbiotic relation between vada pav vendors and Shiv Sena. When the Sena was formed in 1966, party chief Bal Thackeray had encouraged the Marathi youth to set up vada pav stalls. Shiv Sena was launched on 19th June 1966. Its rapid rise came directly from urban unemployment. Sena started demanding jobs for Maharashtrians in Bombay. Sena campaigned for the expulsion of immigrant workers so as to make place for the sons of the soil. Shiv Sena owes its origin to the bitter feelings of frustration taking hold of the rank and file of young Maharashtrians, according to a leaflet called Shiv Sena Speaks. Maharashtrians find their interests woefully neglected. This is from the leaflet Shiv Sena Speaks. The slogan of Shiv Sena was Maharashtra for Maharashtrians at that time. Its program was to force the state and central governments to give preference to Maharashtrians in employment and housing in Bombay. In this context, it is in this context that Shiv Sena leader Bal Thackeray began to tell Marathi-speaking youth to resort to self-reliance and self-employment. In 1966, party chief Thackeray encouraged Marathi people to set up vada pav stalls. In the 1960s, some Shiv Sena protest signs read, Idli dosha bhagavo. Send idli and dosha away from Bombay. It refers to the two well-known snacks, foods of South India. Shiv Sainiks attacked South Indian restaurants. There was a general kind of attacks against South Indians and immigrants. This is because Bal Thackeray accused the South Indians of taking jobs that rightfully belonged to the Marathi Manus. The last part, the political contestations with vada pav. The Sena organized a vada pav contest in 2008 at Shivaji Park, Bombay. This was with a view of starting Sena's own brand of vada pav. Shiv Sena organized this competition to select the best recipes and methods. The party had sought the help of the fast food giant McDonald's for the competition, and they had readily agreed for that. On 19 June 2009, the party president Uddhav Thackeray inaugurated a standardized fast food brand called Shiv Vada Pav. On that occasion, Uddhav said that this is an effort to create employment among the youth and to popularize Maharashtrian food. Now, there's a kind of effort to project vada pav as, essentially Maharashtrian food. Sena leaders had said that only Maharashtrians would be allotted the Sena-sponsored stalls to help them secure self-employment. This is the Shiv Vada Pav stall. While serving vada pav, the vendors wearing saffron uniform would greet customers with Jai Maharashtra. They will greet them, Jai Maharashtra. Then they will give vada pav. Okay. After taking the money, I suppose. Yeah. Sena used vada pav not only as a marker of regional identity, but also as a cultural symbol to mobilize people in local electoral politics with some degree of success. After Shiv Sena began its trademark fast food, two more political groups announced creation of their own branch of vada pav. Sena Shiv Vada Pav generated considerable political heat. The ensuing contestations between rival political groups opened up new form of gastro-nativism. For example, Republican Party of India leader Ramdas Athawale, I suppose it's correct to pronounce, Athawale, no? Okay. Announced his decision to create Beam Vada Pav. Apparently, Beam stands for Bhimrao Ambedkar. Athawale stated that the aim of Beam Vada is to provide employment opportunities to the backward class youth. 2011, the then Industries Minister Narayan Rane's younger son, Nitish Rane, launched a Chhatrapati Vada. This launch was done 8 months prior to the key Bombay civic body elections. This added further controversy to the politics of food at a regional level. Rane said that Chhatrapati Vada was to counter Shiv Vada brand launched by Shiv Sena. Rane said, we will set up our stalls wherever there are Shiv Vada Pav stalls. These are all quotations from newspapers. Thus, at least 3 groups of differing political affiliations have begun their own brands of Vada Pav. This gave a new twist, not only to the politics of food, but also the identity politics in Bombay. The invocation of the name of the regional hero named Chhatrapati Shivaji for Vada Pav resulted in political controversy. Maratha Mahasangh has taken a serious objection over the use of the name Chhatrapati Shivaji. From 2008 onwards, the gastronomic discourse surrounding Vada Pav took a distinct turn as a political weapon in Maharashtra. Nationalist Congress Party NCP questioned the wisdom of belittling the Maratha king by associating him with the bread, pav. According to Congress leader Anand Gadgil, renaming is generally done to express reverence for a great leader. He said that anointing Vada Pav after Shivaji is lowering the status of a great king. Narayan Rane pointed out that the Shiv Sena leaders have started using expensive cars, but they want Marathi youth to sell Vada Pav. Rane wondered why the youth was not protesting against this insult. In May 2008, Shiv Sena retained the Thana Lok Sabha seat by an impressive margin of over 90,000 votes in the by-elections. Uddhav Thackeray commented on the victory. This is a victory of the Marathi spirit displayed by the voters of Thane. The Vada Pav issue reflected the mood of the Marathi Manus, quoting Uddhav Thackeray. It is important to pay attention to Shiv Sena discourse of Vada Pav as food of Marathi culture. Shiv Sena has been trying to project Vada Pav as part and parcel of Marathi culture and identity. According to Shiv Sena leader Sanjay Raut, Vada Pav is the food of Marathi culture. I had written somewhere in the paper that most of the ingredients of Vada Pav, they come from abroad. Pav is a Portuguese thing. Potato in the Vada is from South America. Chili is a Central American import. Central American. Okay, so most of the things are from abroad, but they are projecting now it as a Marathi food. Sorry. Sanjay Raut have even suggested that the patent for the dish, Vada Pav, should rest with the Maharashtrians, and the party should not rest until it becomes a cultural movement. Conclusion. In tracing the life history of Vada Pav, this paper suggests that the puzzle of Shiv Sena's relatively successful use of food as symbol depends on some important variables peculiar to that region, called Maharashtra and Bombay. The biography of street food needs to be woven through the variables such as the demographic patterns, economic factors, political culture, and culture and social factors specific to Bombay and Maharashtra. It is a combination of these variables and their cumulative effect rather than single factor, more than any single factor, which has acted as condition for the possibility of Sena's effective use of the food symbolism. There are evidences which suggest that things have not been going smoothly for Shiv Vada Pav. Referring to a 2015 High Court judgment which banned cooking on the streets, the public interest litigation saw the removal of more than 250 stalls operating without licenses of Shiv Vada Pav. Okay? They were in power at that time. In August 2016, the Bombay High Court directed Bombay Municipal Corporation to take action against illegal Shiv Sena Vada Pav stalls within 3 months. In spite of such order from the High Court, the illegal Shiv Vada Pav stalls have been functioning with ingenious method. They merely whitewashed their signboards, and BMC officials now claim they can't demolish these stalls because, at least on paper, no stalls exist by that name. With all this litigation, Shiv Vada Pav seems to be facing some sort of existential crisis. Moreover, after the Shiv Sena split, recent split, Shiv Vada Pav has become even more precarious, the existence. Nothing much is seen or heard about Shiv Vada Pav in the media. All these show the limitations of food as a regional political symbol in Maharashtra. Thank you very much.
Dr. Sebastian was presenting the politics of Vada Pav as a marker of regional identity as well as a cultural symbol. Its context, contestations, and limitations. So let us put a big hand to Dr. Sebastian.
This is I've been to many seminars. This is the first time I stopped a presentation without receiving a chit. Thank you.
Now it's the time for interactions. We welcome both Dr. Sebastian and Nishant over to the dais. And we have 15 minutes for interactions. Those who want to raise questions, please stand up. Raise your name and then address the person whom you are addressing and then raise the issue.
My name is Sandeep. My question goes to Dr. Sebastian. For the wonderful presentation about Vada Pav, we have also spoken of how in Maharashtra the politics was, the dynamic was working between the political parties and all that. But I would like to add something to it, that Vada Pav is also called the food of the poor of Maharashtra. And there is also an emotional element from the side of the people attached to it. It's because I myself is a Maharashtrian, I know all this. So, and another factor that I would like to mention here is that in Maharashtra, there was a tradition called Madhukari. Madhukari is a tradition wherein the students, especially Pune being the Oxford of the East, a lot of students come to Pune in order to have their admissions in the university and study. So how do they manage? So these people, these students, they used to go house to house and get food. But then there were some people who were against that, because that was only said for the upper caste people, not for the lower caste. So how to put up with this issue? So then there was all this movement like, yes, students are suffering. So it was the students, like they wanted to nourish themselves with some food. So you will see now also from different villages when students come to Pune, in Pune University and all, throughout the day there will be students who will be eating Vada Pav. Vada Pav for breakfast, Vada Pav for lunch, Vada Pav for dinner.
Raise the question.
Yeah. So my question is this: like giving the treatment to the theme, like in this line with the political and all, and not going into the sentiment of the students. How far it is right?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Going with the students, the group, neglecting the group
Yeah.
of the students in
Yeah.
this presentation.
So I would imagine that plenty of students, Kirti College and Dadar and so many college students, they find Vada Pav very cheap, and all those things are there. All those things, absolutely no doubt about it. Okay, my focus was mainly the political aspect of Vada Pav. What you said is right, absolutely right. Okay, I have one small question for you and to the other audience. He said that Pune is the Oxford of the East. Do you know which is the Oxford of the South? You don't know. It is Palangote, the place of Father Nishant. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you both of you for your papers. My question, one question for Father Nishant and one question for Father Sabi. To Father Nishant, it is about the appeal that you made. When you asked for accommodation and cohabitation, the question is who should accommodate? A powerful vegetarian minority should accommodate non-powerful, non-vegetarian majority, or it's the other way? Who should accommodate, and how do you make that criteria for which is the frame of reference, or which should be as a kind of an advantageous position. That's for your appeal. The question is for Father Sabi about, you said the food as a failed political symbol. Now, is it because the food is a failed political symbol, or because of who should own that symbol? For example, even the contestation between Shiv Sena and Bhim, Shiv Vada Pav, Bhim Vada Pav, and Chhatrapati Shivaji Vada Pav. Now, it is not a failure of food as a failed political symbol, but as the one who should own it. Perhaps who successfully market it would own up that political symbol. So it's a more failure of the marketing or the owning, who should own the symbol of Vada Pav, or the food in its essence will be a failed political symbol. Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry that I couldn't develop the last part of it. The whole area of accommodation and cohabitation is to be understood in conjunction with a legislation that keeps the public order first and foremost. In other words, the religious demands and requirements must be considered subservient to it. But of course, a legislation alone cannot necessarily lead to a successful implementation of this, and therefore a certain amount of accommodation and cohabitation. So it is only a complementary part. It's not the only thing. So if you see it as a complementary part, if the legislation is very clear where the boundaries rest, I did not think here in terms of higher class and lower class. I thought in terms of the religion and the religious. Obviously, there are some few people in the authority of religions, they have their axe to grind. I understand that from the point of view of the powerful minority. But at the same time, this accommodation is only in terms of, it can happen only in the presence of a right legislation where the boundaries are clearly demarcated. To what extent the religion can enter into dictating terms for not only their own people, religious people, but also others, imposing it on others. So that's the kind of cohabitation and accommodation I was referring to. I didn't think of individuals in that case, of powerless and powerful.
Thank you, Father.
Very briefly, you see, when you have certain opportunity, then people, politicians, parties, latch on to that. It's an opportunity for them. I'm in the context of what about. See, I read some years ago that one hair oil company used Mahatma Gandhi as their mascot. Mahatma Gandhi. You see, there are many factors which go into the meaning of creation of symbols. And when the meaning declines and breaks of fragments, the meaning behind it also goes away. Now, Vada Pav, there are many contestants. There are certain political contexts, historical contexts which gave rise to Shiv Sena. There are so many factors which are contributing to the coming of Vada Pav as a symbol. The same way, there are many factors which are also contributing to the decline of Vada Pav as a political symbol. Yeah. Okay. So that's what I would like to say. Ownership, I am not very sure about. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Father.
Yes. I am Arul. My first question is to Dr. Nishant. Dr. Nishant, thank you very much for your paper on food, politics, and religion. I want to know if you have any, is there any reason in presenting Islam after Judaism, and then you went on to present Christianity chronologically, so please, can you explain if there is any reason for that?
The simple reason is because Christianity claims at least that we have no prohibition so much. Islam still has quite a lot of prohibitions. The continuity between Judaism and Islam when it comes to food prohibitions, they seem to be getting along very well. Whereas we, for example, eating pork, which is one of the most important prohibitions in Judaism, is continued in Islam. Also the consumption of blood, which is continued in Judaism. So whereas in Christianity, these things, at least, in principle, we don't take it seriously. That's the reason I came. I didn't develop that, I have developed in the paper, I couldn't present it, whether we have really ended that. And the problem of the globalization, whether the whole question of halal in Islam is really possible. Even the Islamic scholars say it is not really possible if you understand halal in a larger sense of the term. What is unlawful? It's much more complicated. For want of time, I just left out. The reason for this is not chronological, but more in terms of who has more prohibitions.
Oh, thank you. Also, with a comment, with regard to eating fish on Fridays, in some regions or in some countries that Catholics do eat, meat on Fridays, like in some of the African countries. And then my next question is to Dr. Sebastian. Can we draw some parallels between the politics of Vada Pav and the salt satyagraha started by Mahatma Gandhiji in the year 1930?
Thank you for your question. Both the salt satyagraha and Vada Pav, they come from entirely different political backgrounds. Salt satyagraha, Gandhi, it's the most common item used in the food preparation, that is salt, and the British government imposed tax on it. Gandhi was a master politician, a tremendously intelligent user of political symbols. So he made use of this symbol to rally people around, and he got a huge amount of support for that. And he goes to which place? Dandi, the seashore. He just takes a handful of salt, and all over India they followed Gandhi's example. So it was a powerful symbol, very different type of symbol than Vada Pav. Vada Pav is employment and things like that, and grievances against migrants, etc. So entirely different political context. Okay? Yeah, thank you.
Only time for two questions, one from Father Ferravo, the other from Father Daulichan.
This question is to Father Nishant. I thought the food politics of India is guided by the principle of Sanskritization. And that's why higher sattvic food remains higher. Now, entrusting it to the state apparatus to monitor and maybe oversee accommodation isn't not inviting trouble, because the state apparatus could be also Sanskritized or be subjected to Sanskritization.
I think by Sanskritization, what you imply is the Brahminization, not so much the language, but the power that is concentrated in the hands of the Brahmins of this country. Now, you see, the state apparatus, when we speak, I'm referring to in a democratic context, though democracy may seem to be a futile enterprise in India as of now. We cannot dismiss of this form of government, because in some way or the other, we have to have faith in the public voice in terms of the voting. And it is from that perspective, I'm coming here typically from the constitutional democracy of Habermas. From that point of view, this is the only option. The present ruling dispensation may be Sanskritized from that point of view, but this need not be necessarily the case if democracies or the institutions of democracies can be further strengthened. And sooner or later, we know history tells us that no fascism can really survive. So I think we have to take it as a passing phenomenon and must continue to have good faith in democracy.
Thank you for both the presenters. And this is not exactly a question, but a response to Dr. Nishant's presentation. I personally would have appreciated a bit more elaboration on the sociological aspect of your paper. There is, from a psychological point of view, one explanation that is given is that the puritanical morality is part of harm-based morality. So when you place certain restrictions on certain food items, it is in a sense a marker or a training in controlling your own impulses, which is required for social living. And in relation to the question that Father asked with regard to less restriction on food, at least theoretically in Christianity, sometimes some authors do say that compared to Islam and Judaism, Christianity has more relaxation on eating food, but more restrictions on the use of sex. Whereas both in Judaism and in Islam, there is a more liberal attitude to sex. I'm not sure how true that theory is, but there is some explanation given on those lines. Thank you.
I'm not very sure about it, particularly because if you correlate your psychological explanation to the laxity of sexual morality which you are referring to, the psychological explanation, which is true, the psychological explanation which you are saying, many scholars do say, the restrictions on food practices will help us to have better moral life. And if Christianity is having less restrictions, then the Christianity must be having less moral, at least expressions in common life. But you seem to be saying the opposite. Christianity seems to be more strict with sexual morality compared to other two religions. So I'm not very sure whether this is true. The latter part of your claim, I'm not sure it is true. But the psychological explanation seems to be. That is also in India. That Satvik food should avoid, onions and garlic. These are all part of the explanation they try to give. But again, that has its own problems. I didn't have time to touch upon it, but you are very right.
My dear friends, we had an engaging session thanks to Dr. Nishant and
Thank you, Andrew, for moderating this session, and thanks to Nishant and Sebastian for the presentations on socio-religious and socio-political aspects of food. Now let us take a short break. Please come back to this hall by 11:45. The next presentation will be done by Asim and Kuru. Thank you.
Hello.
there are QR codes available on the sides of this hall. Please scan them to access the abstracts. To continue with the conference, let us now have Sandeep Jagtap to moderate this session. Sandeep is a tutor in Jnanadeepa and belongs to the Department of Indian Studies. Apart from the required degrees to teach philosophy at Jnanadeepa, he also has an MA in Pali from Pune University, in which he secured a gold medal as well. Sandeep, we request you, please come to the stage.
Dear friends, welcome to this third session and the second panel discussion of our seminar. It's themed as Food and Societal Change, under which we are going to have two paper presentations. First is by Dr. Azim Siddiqui. He will be presenting the paper entitled An Anti-Caste Approach to Engaging with Religious Food Taboos in India. Then second, by Dr. Kuruvilla Pandikatu, themed Food for Thought, Ethics, Emancipation, and Exploitation of Food Culture. A word of introduction to both of these paper presenters of this session. Dr. Azim Siddiqui is a faculty of philosophy and development at Azim Premji University for the past 7 years. As a teacher, researcher, and socio-cultural worker, he works towards issues of social and cultural justice by drawing upon philosophical traditions from India and South America. In his doctoral research, he conceptualized an Ambedkarite feminist critical pedagogy for an ethico-political transformation of education. Beyond university, he does academic consultancy, experiential education workshops, and dramaturgy for various arts and developmental organizations. Previously, he taught at the Study Abroad program of the University of Minnesota and has worked with NGOs and technology startups, along with getting an engineering degree from IIT Delhi. A word about Dr. Kuruvilla Pandikatu. Dr. Kuruvilla Pandikatu is a chair professor of J.R.D. Tata Foundation for Business Ethics at XLRI, Jamshedpur, and was a professor of physics, philosophy, and religion at Jnanadeepa Institute of Philosophy and Theology, Pune, India. He has been actively involved in the religious dialogue between science and religion. He has authored or edited more than 45 books and 240 academic articles. Main topics of his research are ethics, including business and applied anthropology, artificial intelligence, life management, and transhumanism. I welcome both of them on the dais.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Also, my first time. Thank you for the invite for presenting this paper. I'm very happy to be here and talking to all of you. I'll do a mix of reading the paper, and there will be some graphs and charts on statistics that I will show. So hopefully it is interesting and engaging, and I would like a lot of questions. Hopefully I can keep you interested. So what I'm going to present is a kind of anti-caste approach to engaging with religious food taboos. We have already heard a lot about food taboos in religion by Dr. Nishant, and the first keynote speech had also a lot of this in the Indian context. So I will also bring more from an anti-caste perspective. And also I will draw on liberation theology. So this is a strong tradition in South America, which I draw upon. But in India also, we have thriving, you can say, liberation theology. I know in this institute as well, there are people interested in that. So liberation theology and liberation philosophy is something which is very important for my work. Okay, so I'll read parts of it and I'll then come to the PPT. I have 4 sections. I'll just tell you about them. So I'll just give a brief context, and then I'm going to talk about Baba Saheb Ambedkar's conception of food politics. I'll draw on Ambedkar and Kancha Ilya and Suryakant in this section. Then my main theoretical section will be on weaponization of ethics for domination. So I will talk about how ethics get weaponized and what is the politics of that. Then I'll talk a little bit about religious liberation theology in India, and then come to the final conclusion on anti-caste approach to food politics. It wouldn't be a mistake to place food politics as the center of India's independence struggle, as the first war of independence in 1857, as you know, was said to be triggered by the use of beef and pork fat in cartridges of Enfield rifle, treated as taboo meat by certain Hindu and Muslim communities. The same beef and pork meat have also been used as an easy bait to incite riots by throwing them in front of temples or mosques, as taboo food can trigger a kind of corporeal disgust and anger which is unparalleled by anything else, and that's why food is so centered to politics, right? Similarly, Jain, Buddhist, Sikh, Christian and other religions and cultures in India too have a developed understanding of what is and what is not permissible food. Even after independence, taboo food politics has remained central to Indian social life, as it determines who among our fellow citizens we socialize with, and more importantly, who we don't, right? So our social lives are also dependent a lot on this. Historically, these food taboos arise from certain religious cultural ethics that are embedded in the life world of the communities and get culturally passed on over generations. Food taboos are central to communities' culture so that this knowledge can continually be passed on to children, right? Most of the times, the religious reasoning, theological reasoning is coupled with either reasoning of health and nutrition and or ecological reasoning, which determines what kind of food becomes taboo. In addition, the cultural understanding of how the body functions and what is required at different times of the day or the season influence how certain food taboos emerge. I'll give you an example of an Aboriginal tribe. So Orang Asli or Aboriginal tribe have also very developed, so though it is you can say a primitive tribe, but it has very developed food taboos, right? Of course, human flesh is taboo, but apart from that, children can only eat small animals whose spirits are seen as weak. So children are small, their spirits are weak, so they can only eat small animals. As they grow up, they can start eating bigger animals, keeping in mind the difference in strength. So you can only eat animals who have a weaker spirit than you. Pregnant women similarly can only eat small animals as well, like rats, frogs, etc. But there is one more criteria: the animal should have been caught and killed by a near relative. So that is also part of the ethics. Eating meat of new and unfamiliar species is taboo. For obvious reason, as there may be unknown effects, primarily fear of getting poisoned. Similarly, there are ideas of kosher and halal in Jewish and Islamic cultures, and ahimsa or non-harm in Jain, Buddhist and Hindu cultures. Thus, we can see that food taboos exist across cultures, irrespective of whether these societies are simple or complex. However, food taboos, more than working as a self-disciplining practice, get used for disciplining others. And these others can be both inside community members as well as out community members. In Indian context, this maps directly onto the logic of caste, as food taboos become an essential criterion to associate purity and pollution. Some restriction on meat, 81% of India's general population. This map also you must have seen. This is the controversy about not providing eggs in midday meal, right? And as you can see, only South India and East, you can see students getting eggs. Where I come from, Karnataka, there was a big controversy of not giving eggs, and students, very young students, came out and said, we want eggs, right? Motte beku, which is Kannada for we want eggs. But you can see North Central, lot of children are not getting eggs because of this thing. And this is, of course, when the state gets involved, state power gets involved. There was a question, if the state itself has certain leanings, then what happens? And as you can see, all the red marked states, which is north central to Karnataka, are all having ban on cow slaughter, right? So very few states in northeast have no ban. Most have some restriction or the other. So why should the state be interested in who you eat, how you eat, all of that? We know there is a long history to it. Okay, so just wanted to show you some statistics, and I'll come back to the more, you can say, how I am understanding all of this, right? So I will first start with the anti-caste thinkers, of how they have thought about food politics. Of course, there are disputes to this, but I will start. So to explicate the logic of caste in food taboos in India, it is important to revisit Babasaheb Ambedkar's important work from 1948, which was titled The Untouchables, Who Were They and Why They Became Untouchables. In this book, Ambedkar argues that food and caste system are deeply intertwined. Drawing from various Hindu Shastras and historical accounts, Ambedkar attempts to answer this question, which Dr. Nishant has also posed. When did Brahmins give up animal sacrifice, including cow sacrifice and beef eating, and become vegetarians? When did that happen, right? Why did that happen? So this, of course, is disputed as Dr. Nishant himself has pointed out. D.N. Jha has said that it happens later in medieval times, but Ambedkar is saying it is happening between the conflict of Brahmanism and Buddhism, and Brahmins are thinking that, okay, now that we are losing ground, we need to give up on animal sacrifice as well as eating meat. They strategize that becoming vegetarians can provide them the required moral high ground, and I'll come to this phrase, moral high ground, a bit more. I will develop this, to denounce Buddhism and create a hierarchy between vegetarians, meat eaters, and beef eaters. So it's not a binary. It's three things. Ambedkar explicates that there are two dimensions of the connection between food and caste. At the first level, eating of vegetarian food separates the Brahmin community from rest of the society, which are non-vegetarian. Of course, with Sanskritization has already come up. Other groups have also given up meat to circumvent the discrimination. So you are not choosing to eat vegetarian food, but because you experience so much discrimination, you are like, okay, let me try to become vegetarian so that I get excluded from all the discrimination. I'm not facing that all the time, right? I'm sure many of you, if you have tried getting houses, right, the first question you get asked is, are you vegetarian or non-vegetarian? So if you're tired of that, if you're like, I'm not getting house anywhere, I want to get a house, I want to rent or buy, whatever. Like, I have faced that all the time, and sometimes I have to change my name and do all of that to say, no, I'm vegetarian so that I'll get a house, right? At the second level, meat-eating communities are separated from those who eat beef, because of which the beef-eating communities are treated as outside to the Varna food. Thus, the creation of taboo of beef eating created the line between touchables and untouchables. So the first line is between Brahmins and rest of the society, of vegetarian and non-vegetarian, and then between even meat eating and beef eating, there is a line of the touchable and the untouchable. Right? Quoting Vedvyasa Smriti, Ambedkar claims that origin of untouchability has to be found in beef eating. So this is a quote from Vedvyasa Smriti. Charmakars, which are the cobblers, bhatta, soldiers, the bhilla, the rajaka, the pushkara, the nata, the vrata, the meda, the chandala, the dasa, the swabapaka, and the kolika, these are known as antyaja or untouchable, as well as others, those who eat cow's flesh. So this is from an older Smriti, which is saying eating cow's flesh makes you untouchable, right? So thus food taboo, especially with beef, becomes the central explanation for the practice of untouchability in South Asia. The entire schema of purity and pollution gets associated with what food you eat, who cooks the food, how you segregate utensils and eating areas of different people, who can eat with whom. In short, everything about food actually becomes a tool to discriminate and dominate those who eat meat, especially beef. Thus, instead of giving up of meat as an ascetic practice, so this is something we will come to it when, so Gandhi kind of thinks of this giving up of meat as a very ascetic practice of self-discipline, right? It's not, I want to impose it on others, but I want to take it up on my own. It gets weaponized against food practices of Dalit, Adivasis, and minorities, leading to untouchability and lynchings. Although Muslim community as a whole is targeted in the name of cow trade and beef eating, they themselves use the food taboo against pork in a similar way. It is not only seen as a self-disciplining practice, but gets used to discriminate and exclude those who eat, sell, or cook pork using the same purity pollution lens. Many tribal Muslims and Muslims in the northeast of India do eat pork as a cultural practice, but is seen as haram as shown in the charts earlier. Vegetarianism in Jainism and Sikhism, which are also minority religions, but they also use food taboos to discriminate people in not giving them houses for rent or refusing to interdine and socialize. Okay, so now I'm coming to the main part of my paper. I'm short of time a little bit, so I'll try to do this quickly, which is weaponization of ethics. So what I'm trying to say is ethics of what you eat, what you not eat is not as much as a problem, but what is the bigger problem is when you weaponize it to perpetuate violence and discrimination. So based on the above examination, we can observe that food taboos armed with dominant religious reasoning have been the most potent weapon to create a cultural hegemony and suppress the cultural practices of weaker communities. Suryakant Wagmore argues that environmental ethics and animal rights are deployed to support vegetarianism, but the actual purpose of this exercise is to dehumanize those who eat meat. Building on this idea, I want to come to my central thesis on how ethics, which ideally guides us to good life, can instead get weaponized for the purpose of domination and hegemony. Ethical thinking, as we know, is central to all religions in guiding actions and practices of its followers, not harming other beings, having compassion, friendliness, equality, fairness, understanding consequences of one's actions, as well as the overall ethical conduct of oneself from the core of religious reasoning. As a child, one gets introduced to the ethical conduct permissible by the religion, which she grows up and finds them as guide to figure out what they want to do. In this sense, religious ethics are helpful for an individual and community to coexist with each other in a just manner. However, when religious ethics or even secular ethics are directed as a weapon to dehumanize other communities, ethics get used for completely opposite purpose. During colonization, we know the Europeans consistently used ethical reasoning to dehumanize native communities and label them as primitive or without any morals. In the Indian context, most native cultures were seen as without any morals through the white gaze, which led many upper caste men to then become reformers of their backward religious practices. We know the example of how Sadir, which is a South Indian dance form of temple courtesan, was sanitized and moralized to make it Bharatnatyam, erasing all aspects of sensuality to make it pure. Similarly, with food taboo, upper caste reformers tried to impose a universal Brahminical morality on the consumption of meat as impure. This weaponization of food ethics has taken its most vicious form in the past few years as more and more violence is being perpetuated in the name of making people moral. As we saw earlier, food taboos are present in almost all cultures, including indigenous communities, but they are very contextual. It depends on the people involved, the time, the situation, and many other specific factors. It becomes extremely difficult to generalize them across time and space to come up with universal food taboos that can become action guiding rules for all human beings at all times. Even when there is attempt to pass the cultural knowledge about food taboos to the next generation, it is acknowledged that change in time will change the context, and that will have an effect on what can be considered as taboo food. For instance, it is possible that a community has made an unfamiliar animal meat as taboo because of it being poisonous, but once you know about the animal more, you realize it's no more poisonous and you can start eating it. Right? Even pork, which is considered taboo food in Jewish and Muslim communities, and the reason primarily is associated with health and many other things, which can be disputed. But you can contest that now. You can say, okay, maybe there are new technologies of cleaning, cooking the meat, different things that you can do. And also what Dr. Nishant said, that for the purpose of fraternity, for the purpose of actually interdining, can you step out of your food taboos? So it needs to be very context specific and sensitive. Thus, weaponizing ethics of food can happen once we try to generalize context specific practices on all human beings at all times with a purpose to dehumanize and dominate them. The dehumanization of weaker groups as barbaric or uncivilized allows for justification or violence and oppression, right? Once you say that, oh, these are non-human, these are barbaric, so you can do anything to them without feeling any moral guilt, right? Morality around food taboos can easily be weaponized to claim a moral high ground and perpetuate violence against weaker group. So then how do we address this very serious issue? And I'm just going to come to interreligious liberation theology, which is my last section. Yeah, I'll just finish it quick. So rationalists, liberal and left critics of religion have argued that it's an essential problem with all religions, that religious reasoning always get used to dominate and oppress. So let's get done away with the religion. We will have an atheist, non-religious society. We'll be fine, right? That's their utopia. But we know that, and it was actually an hope that with modernity coming up, people will become less religious and secular ethics will solve all the problems. But we know that didn't happen. Neither did religious influence recede, nor were secular ethics immune to being weaponized. Secular ethics can easily also get weaponized. It's not only religious ethics that get weaponized. Historically, religious reasoning has also been employed in fights against injustice and inequality by many marginalized groups, whether it is Buddhism or Bhakti Sufi traditions in South Asia, or liberatory Christianity in South America, or Karamita Shia Muslims in Middle East. Many places religion has, or religious reasoning has allowed, religious ethics have allowed to liberate you from domination. So both can happen, right? So how do we distinguish between the two? How do we distinguish religious reasoning which is there to dominate and religious reasoning which is there to liberate you? And that's where I come to my final point of anti-caste approach. So what is an anti-caste approach, and why it seems like it's a negative thing, right? That, oh, it's against something. And that's how things are, because injustice happens so much that you have to first highlight what is the injustice and then say, okay, we have to come up with a. So there have been a long tradition of anti-caste thinkers in India, as you know, right from Buddhism onwards to many, many saints, and more so in the 19th century, 20th century with Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, with Ambedkar, with Periyar, right? So there is, what are they saying? They are saying that you can have ethics as part of your religious reasoning, very good. You can have food taboos, but always make sure that they are not being used to weaponize what other people are doing, right? To dehumanize them, right? So what is anti-caste approach is saying, first we need to disconnect religiously sanctioned food taboo from strategies to impose it on others. So even if there is a food taboo, use it as a self-disciplining practice, see if it works for you. Don't impose it on others, right? Which is where Gandhi comes into the picture a bit, right? You practice on your own, don't try to impose on others. But what is even more important is that we know that some food taboos can easily lend itself for violence, like taboo against beef. It lends itself easily to lynchings, lends itself easily to discrimination, and it's a long history, it's not something new. So then you have to really rethink those taboos. Can you still continue it? Because you know that as soon as you have it, it will lead to something, right? And that's where upper caste communities of all religions, I'm not only talking about Hinduism here, even in Muslims we have upper caste, Christianity has upper caste, Sikhs have upper caste. They start using these ethics as a weapon to target lower caste communities. And therefore, attachment to religious food taboos and its imposition on others without being sensitive to the context of time, space, and power allows ethical practices to get weaponized, which truly goes actually against all religious practices. Thank you. Sorry for the little bit time. I had a long paper, so I was just cutting short. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hasim, for your scholarly and thought-provoking presentation. Now I request Father Kurovilla to make his presentation of the paper.
So good morning to all of you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. And my presentation, unlike the previous ones, is just limited to the economy, the ethics, and the health of using food, especially the poultry, the farm products. To begin with, let's start off with one German proverb, which I suppose should be easy for all of us to understand. Men east was ere east. It simply means a human person, we are what we eat. The food habits, the content of our food, that determines and shapes all of us. Man east was er east. So with this background, I just want to share with you the food for thought, and especially connected to the poultry farming that is practiced not only all over India, but also all over the world. This is just the abstract. You can already read through it. In poultry farming, around 60 billion chickens. You know that the population of the world is 8 billion, but the number of chickens would be 60 billion. After introducing a little bit on factory farming, then the battery caged farm, which is a part of the factory farming, we will just look into the consequences of this kind of farming called the poultry farming, factory farming. The neglect and welfare standards of animals, followed by the really cruel practice of starving the chicken so that they can molt and they can give more eggs. Then the emergence of antibiotic resistance, which will, through the food we eat, also become part of our human life. Finally, the zoonotic diseases, that would be diseases like the coronavirus, which could very well be part of a bigger problem by using this kind of factory farming. Then we look into some ethical and moral, consequences and issues, some suggestions, and finally the conclusion. India raises about 460 or approximately 500 million hens annually, both to produce eggs and also the meat. And sad to say, 80% of these eggs come from industrial animal farms, that is a factory farming. We will see the consequences of that kind of a farming. And that gives rise to very poor animal welfare situation when we look into the life, the destiny of the chickens, and it will have impact on the environment, on our own health. Again, the numbers from statistical service. You have the difference between the egg-laying hens, popularly called layers, and the birds raised for meat, popularly, as we know, called broilers. See the difference in the numbers. The broilers are actually running into, thank you. See, the broilers would be about 5 times more, and that is the normal food we take when we eat chicken. And again, another factor, the eggs are rich in proteins, but only about 10 eggs per capita for the Indian population at the moment is available. And that would imply, in spite of the vegan and vegetarian tradition, we really need more eggs so that the per capita consumption could be more. But the problem is, how do we produce these eggs that we badly need? The underweight children, the rural folks who still go hungry in our emerging or developing economies, that is a concern. And to some extent, to a limited extent, egalitarian and humane way of nurturing chicken can emancipate the situation of the poor. Now the battery cage chickens are, as some of you would have seen it, when chickens are kept as we keep the batteries together. We will see later how cruel this practice could be and how torturous for the chicken themselves is. This kind of farming, the factory farming for the chicken and the consequences that leads to it. This would be some photos if you can see how chicken are kept one after another, just like we arrange the batteries. The sad thing is, in a battery caged chicken, the size the space that one chicken gets is almost enough of a A4 size paper. That is all the space that a chicken gets. They cannot move around, they cannot go around. Even when they lay the egg, they need a special place which these battery cages don't provide. Just imagine we being limited just to stand and not being able to move for any of our natural needs. Therefore, many of the chicken, they throw away their dungs and the dungs become part of their food. In this process, it contaminates the soil, the air, the water. It affects the health workers and also the residents living around these farms. And a study conducted by CSIR said that if we can remove this battery caging concept and if we can leave this chicken free to roam about, then there would be significant reduction in the pollution of the groundwater and the levels of so many of the chemicals that are part of this caged system. So odor and housefly infestation in cage-free farms are much less and the welfare of the animals are greatly improved if we can free them from the caged farm of the factory farm. Therefore, today, especially in the West, conscious farmers are demanding what kind of a farm is being used to produce the chicken as well as the meat. So there is a need, there is a demand to switch from factory cage system to cage-free facilities. So this is a quote from Konrad Lorenz. He is a Nobel Prize winner of Austrian origin, and he has been very much involved as an ethologist and ornithologist in dealing with this chicken and the troubles with these animals. And he says, the worst to which a battery hen is exposed is the inability to retire somewhere for the laying act. You know that from our limited experience, when the hen has to lay, it goes to a corner, lays itself, sits down, and then lays the egg. For the person who knows something about animals, it is truly heart-rending to watch how a chicken tries again and again to crawl beneath her fellow cage mates to search there in vain for cover. And this is the inhuman way we treat the chicken. Another quote, battery cages present inherent animal welfare problems, most notably by their small size and barren conditions. Okay, now we look into some of the consequences. The neglect of animal welfare standards. Chickens destined for the egg industry are artificially incubated and hatched by the thousands at commercial hatcheries. For them, what matters is merely the number, nothing more. And then, artificially, they increase the size of the chicken. This is for the broiler chicken. In 1957, if a typical chicken used to weigh just below 1 kilo, in 1978, the chicken weighed about 1.8 kilos. But in 2005, the same chicken on the average weighed 4.2 kilos. So there is increase in size, artificially produced, we will see how. And that is what matters for profit, because we buy or sell the chicken according to the weight. Bacteria and other kind of things. Another problem, consequences would be the de-beaking. That also is very painful. The chicken's beak is artificially cut in a machine. So de-beaking or trimming of the beak of the chicks in poultry farms is a senseless act of cruelty. Why they do it is when they are so closely living together, there is a tendency to cannibalize on other chickens, to fight with them. And to prevent this fight and the cannibalization, they cut off the beak, and it is not only painful, but it actually takes part of their life together. Forced starvation for molting chicken. So there is a natural way of molting for the chicken, and that enables the chicken to get extra energy and to produce the eggs. But in the factory farms, they even spend something like 5 to 21 days without food for the chicken. They may give water after 3 days, but food they may not even give up to 21 days, so that this molting process can be accelerated. And they lose weight, lose their feather, and stop egg production for a few days. Then rejuvenated, these chicken would actually lay more eggs. So the molting of chicken by starvation, that is a forced one, and that is truly barbaric. You see just the title, Forced Molting, the egg industry's cruelest practice. Induced molting can be an effective management tool, enabling you to match egg production with demand and reduce bird cost per dozen eggs. So primarily they are interested in economy, in reducing the cost for the egg. And much more serious is the antibiotic resistance that by or through the chicken, human beings also acquire. The antibiotic superbugs are passed on to human beings because the same antibiotics is given to chicken for their speedy growth, heavier and more elaborate weight, and even many of the antibiotics banned in America have been unfortunately used by Indians. Even the Wengis of Pune, they are guilty of the same practice. And the trouble is, once you give these antibiotics to the chicken, through their meat, it is going to come down to us. And therefore, human beings themselves become resistant to these bacteria, and then the normal normal medication we take will lose its power, and we will be at a loss if a serious sickness connected with that bacteria comes about. The zoonotic diseases are diseases caused by this kind of the factory farms where animals are together, they fight, they struggle, and the bacteria are found in abundance because of the other situations. The health situation is very bad, pollution and microbes are very much. So COVID that we are all experiencing is just one of the many zoonotic diseases. And scientists are afraid that there is a much stronger potential for causing these pandemics if we let uncontrolled production of eggs and meat through factory farming. Some of the ethical and moral issues. The substandard treatment meted out to chickens which are reared for consumption purpose only. Use of chemicals and drugs to alter the appearance and the weight of these chickens, which we are obliged to consume. The harrowing conditions of workers in the chicken facilities working for long in such places can have very adverse effect on one's own health. In order to increase the life of these chickens in storage and augment their breeding process, the chickens are pumped full of antibiotics, an age-old practice. What can consumers do to avoid supporting a system that mistreats livestock and funnels poison and antibiotics into the human food supply? Unfortunately, we are what we eat, and we are forced to eat this kind of a chicken by the factory farming, even against our will or against our knowledge. Again, along with antibiotics, there are also pesticides coming into it. The pollution from animal waste causes respiratory problems, skin infections, nausea, depression, and even death for people who live near the factory farms. And finally, what counts is money, unfortunately, the mad rush for money and profit. The individual consumers may have no choices, but then as a society, we can think over and we can truly make a collective decision. We claim that we are the pinnacle of creation. If so, is this the way that we take care of the other creatures? We claim that we are rational beings, but most of the time we behave irrationally. What about being the shepherds and the guardians of the whole creation? So, we have finished till the 4th section. Just some suggestions. Heavy fines and embargoes must be applied for non-compliance, and governments at the national and international level should come up with clear policies. But of course, you know that when governments come up with policies, it is primarily these factories and these owners who will actually tell the government what laws are to be made, and there will be inbuilt ways of getting through these laws. You know, Peter, people interested in ethical treatment of animals, they have been working for more than 60 years all over the world so that we can treat animals ethically and live in collaboration with them, enhance mutually our life together. A factory farm is a large-scale industrial operation that houses thousands of animals, in some cases even up to 1 lakh, and which will cause untold sufferings to the animals and also to us human beings, their clients or consumers. 2 in 3 animal farms in the world are now factory farmed, and the consequences will be terrible. It is not only limited to the case of chicken, but cows, hog, and other animals are also. Worldwide, this statistics is interesting. About 70 billion farm animals are now reared for food, and that is a huge number. Broiler birds are bred to, in as short a time as possible, gain the maximum amount of weight. The industry selects breeds and strains that have the highest possible feed conversion ratio. This quick growth of muscle on an underdeveloped bone structure leads to many health issues for the birds as well as for us. Thank you very much.
I thank both of our paper presenters for their presentations. Now the floor is open for question, answers, and clarifications. Yes, Father Nishant.
Thank you to both the paper presenters, Dr. Asim and Dr. Kuru. Very enlightening talk. Question is addressed to Kuru. While your concern for the suffering animals, the birds, are very valid, I'm a little afraid there is a little bit of critical engagement with association like PETA and so on when you made reference to PETA. Studies have shown that PETA is an ideological phase of all this kind of so-called welfare of animals, but beneath they got some arrangement with pharmaceutical companies to promote certain kind of food habits that will necessarily have consequence. One example is the A1 milk. The A1 milk is dangerous. It's diabetical. It's prone to diabetics. And PETA has been championing to destroy the native cows which provide A2 milk. These studies have very clearly shown this. So I'm a little worried when you are very sympathetic towards animals, the ideological mask worn by companies like PETA is not critically analyzed, and I would like to have a comment on that.
Hello. It's okay? Yeah. At the moment, I should confess that I have not gone into the whole ideology or their actually prejudices. But so I will not be able to answer to you directly. But then all that I can say there is almost everyone has got their own ideology. And in spite of our ideologies, sometimes they are very bad and sometimes they are tolerable. We need to come together as human beings with all our weakness and vulnerabilities and try to empower and emancipate ourselves. So regarding PETA, I don't have anything to say.
Take a mic.
Thank you for the sharing of your views on these food habits. Azim, just I want to know, what is the basic difference between the, what you call north and central versus the rest of the areas? What makes the difference? Why is it so much different we see in the regarding the eating of the food, vegetarian and anti-vegetarian? And to Kuruvilla, it's scary to listen to you. We are basically chicken eaters. Okay. Now I do not know which is the best chicken to eat. Are you to eat what do you call, country chicken, or what is the best chicken? I don't know what you would suggest to us. Yeah, it is very scary to listen to what you said. What we are eating today is basically the chicken, and for unhealthy chicken, it is that's scary. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You are right to observe that North and Central seem to be quite different from rest of the country, and a very, you can say, the most easy way to think about it is uh, the way, like the upper caste population in these areas, right? And the way the Aryan influence happened in the North and Central, especially towards the West, actually. So that side, you will see more of this vegetarianism being popular. And there have been many movements also, like within, for example, if you look at Jain philosophy and Jain tradition, they also are more predominant in Gujarat, Rajasthan, that area. So this is the way Sikhs have also, like we saw, Sikhism as a religion doesn't necessarily taboo, but in the practice, many of them are not eating. So all of that is contributing to North. And if you look at South Indian context, for example, Tamil Nadu or Kerala, the percentage of like dominant caste, especially Brahmin population, is very, very less, around 3% or 4%, around that, right? Compare this with a state like Uttar Pradesh, where there is 12% of Brahmin population. So a lot of it is dependent on the caste kind of breakage, and also the influence of various, you can say, whether it was Jain culture a little bit, or Aryan culture in that sense. So by the time it goes to other parts of the country, it's kind of diminishes.
Can have only two questions, last two questions. Yeah.
To respond to your part, ideally, chicken grown in our own farms, the country chicken would be best to eat. But the trouble with us is that would be the ideal situation about 40, 50 years ago. Today, with a world population of 8 billion, it is still not possible to feed all of us, and egg has become so common. So the ideal thing would be have your own chicken farming. Don't buy chicken from the hatcheries, because the chicken from the hatcheries are also equally problematic. But the real challenge that we all face would be conscientize ourselves and make these factories aware of the need for an ethical standard, and make sure that they follow these ethical standards. There is no other way. We cannot go back to the old village setup. That's not possible.
Somebody asking question? Yeah. Please give a mic. Yeah.
Question is to Dr. Kuruvilla. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Towards the end, we were talking about the pinnacle of creation, man as pinnacle of creation. I suppose that you are taking a stand which is not radical anthropological stand, anthropocentric stand, but a kind of moderate anthropocentric. But how would you respond to a ecologist, deep ecologist, who would say that we place humans, animals side by side?
At least from our Christian point of view, there is something significantly, from our Christian point of view, man is, let's put it in inverted commas, superior to human beings. But that doesn't give us the right to manipulate the creatures, including animals and plants. So strictly speaking, I don't think we can afford to go vegan or vegetarian. I don't think we can afford, although that would be a better solution for the whole environmental calamity or crisis that we are facing. So we need to find, I would suggest, a middle ground. We cannot treat the animals and the plants at the same level as human beings. But on the other hand, if we are really called to shepherd them, then we do have a responsibility. And since we are the pinnacle, we have a much higher responsibility to treat them ethically, humanely.
We take the last question. Dhoni has a question.
Yes,
there.
a question to Asim and a question to Father Kuru. It's about you were saying about the ethics being weaponized to dehumanize others. Now, basically, there is a kind of a contestation as to whose ethics is better than the other. If we go, can we find a common ground to say that between two religious ethics, as you also mentioned about secular ethics not being immune to weaponizing? Now, I'm asking, what could be the common ground to decide when there is a contest between two ethical groups, or two ethics, groups of ethics, two ideas of ethics? That's my question to you, Asim. To Father Kuru, there is a famous, interesting argument by Yuval Noah Harari about this poultry, cattle, and other things. Now, today, in today's world, there is no other beings which are evolutionarily as successful as these chicken, cattle, and other things are. They are evolutionarily successful animals because of their association at the demand for meat supply. So now, if we are going for such a kind of ethical considerations, with that kind of an ethical treatment of animal rearing, meeting a demand, a global demand for food, as we see a rising population, now 8 billion, in another 10 years we'll reach 10 billion, how do we meet that demand if we put such kind of ethical restriction? Again, the food becomes such kind of a tasty or healthy food, a nutritious food becomes available only to the elite and to the commoner. At least now a common person, when he celebrates a feast, could buy a chicken. At least he could afford a chicken. He might have the satisfaction of eating a chicken. So that's my question.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Very interesting point, and that's why I was bringing context very much at the center of it. So the food taboos that come in religious ethics generally have a certain context when they emerge. And once that gets erased and it becomes universal and generalizable for everyone, then there is this competition of my ethics versus your ethics, right? So one thing is that we need to be really sensitive to the time and space and the power aspect as well. That which is the more dominant community, how are they using their ethical framework to impose on others, right? So, for example, I spoke about liberation theology. Liberation theology is also using ethics. Gandhi also used ethics, right? But from a powerless position, he tried to challenge the British. So there you can take a moral high ground because you have nothing else. You have no state power, you have no other power, right? But Gandhi at the same time had the social power of being an upper caste man, and he used that negatively against women and against lower caste by taking decisions on their behalf, saying that, oh, you are children, I will take decisions for you, right? So the same person can get wrong in different contexts, right? So it's very, very important to be sensitive to the power relationships and the context. So ethics, when we think of ethics as something we can arrive at just by discussion without thinking about the context, I think there is a problem with that. And that's what is happening. Even with this whole thing, the problem is absolutely right that we are destroying the planet. There is the kind of, especially leave chicken, the kind of climate change because of beef and cow consumption is definitely a problem. There is no doubt about it. But how do you address it? Do you weaponize it to target, like you said, what if a poor person has that? That is the only thing they have. That is what they want. So one has to always look at the more powerful group, right? And even when we are talking about climate change and the kind of problems that meat production is doing, there are so many bigger things, like, for example, like flights, the kind of, you can say, carbon dioxide and all the poisonous gases that each flight takes up. But nobody is stopping that because elites are using that, right? So nobody is problematizing that. But all the focus is on, so that's why we are calling about food politics, right? Because it's ethics always get embroiled in this power relation. And that is what will help us decide what is right and wrong in that context.
Capitalism in the last 300 years has been highly successful. Technological growth in the last 400 years has been also highly rewarding. Now, I read recently, it is this success, it is this rapid growth that will lead to its own collapse and failure. The point is, we have the technology and we have the capitalistic mentality to quantify everything, to count everything, and then to multiply it. To a limited extent, we will benefit from it, we will profit from it. But the very success of this kind of a capitalistic mentality will lead to not only its own collapse, unfortunately, I hope not, to the collapse of the human civilization as we know it.
So we thank both of our paper presenters and also the conversations that they engage themselves with our students. Let's give both of them a big round of applause.
Thank you, Sandeep, for moderating the sessions. And thanks to Dr. Asim and Dr. Kuru for the presentations on food and societal change. Now let us break for lunch. Please note that the next session, which is based on food politics, current issues, begins at 3 p.m. There are two paper presenters in this session, Dr. Kenneth and Dr. Mendonça. I repeat, it begins at 3 p.m. Three papers. Thank you and see you later.